love our little family.
She'd spent her life looking for love in all the wrong places.
She was the type that loved and loved hard.
All she really wanted to do was be accepted.
After several failed relationships, she wanted something different.
And she'd finally found it with a man who promised her a better life.
He was handsome, he was consistent.
He was everything that she wanted.
But their passionate love story will end in unimaginable tragedy.
The police arrive, they find her dead.
There were red marks consistent with the strangulation.
The neck looks like it's broken.
Who did this to her?
Did she fall prey to her troubled past?
He said she was on drugs and alcohol.
She was out of control.
Get out!
Or is the truth behind her death from a more present danger?
They realized the unfortunate truth.
He has been putting on a facade of this nice guy.
This life of chaos or life of lies.
I know that you grabbed her off of that. I know that. And you told me what happened after.
August 23rd, 2018. It's a warm summer night in Marietta, Georgia, one of Atlanta's oldest and most charming suburbs, steeped in centuries of history and culture.
Marietta is a picturesque, southern, small-town, comfortable community in Atlanta.
Just good schools, nice area to raise a family.
But being so close to the big city, Marietta residents also deal with their fair share of crime.
It's a very busy urban area, lots of people passing through, lots of traffic, high crime.
And tonight is no exception.
On August 23rd of 2018 at around 3:03 in the morning, officers got a 911 phone call.
Now this is a kind of cryptic call.
What is your emergency?
Yeah, I need some squad. I need
He's saying that he wants the police to do a welfare check on Ziana Graham.
Ziana Graham was a local resident, a mother of 4. The 911 caller was saying she hadn't been answering any of his phone calls.
What do you need us to do for you?
I need you to come and evaluate the situation.
He didn't want to give his name, but he was definitely concerned.
He requested that officers go out to her address.
The police are concerned. Why do they need to go over there?
No, I need to know what I'm sending my officers into.
Well, don't worry about it then.
So what's going on there?
Given the suspicious nature of the call, the operator immediately dispatches officers to Ziana's home.
911 dispatch hurriedly sends police to that location because they want to know what's going on.
Ziana might have been hurt.
When you're dispatched to a welfare check, you don't know what to expect.
24-year-old Ziana Graham had a heart that overflowed with love for the people in her life.
She had a very bubbly personality.
If she was your friend, she loved you deep.
Growing up in the northern reaches of the Bay Area, Ziana was a bright student who connected with people everywhere she went.
Ziana, she grew up on the West Coast in Vallejo, which is near Sacramento.
At a very young age, Ziana was a friendly person. She wanted to make friends with everybody that she met.
But when trouble reared its head at home, Ziana's strong spirit was put to the test.
I had a troubled marriage with her mother in the beginning of Ziana's life.
Their parents separated early on.
Instead of healing, time only brought more problems for the Graham family.
Her father was deployed shortly after 9/11, and upon return came back with issues around drug and alcohol abuse.
I began using drugs and drinking quite a bit.
Eventually, Ziana's mother was granted full custody, and her father sort of drifted out of her life.
I loved Ziana very much. But it's like the more it didn't work out for me, the more I turned to alcohol.
And Ziana wasn't far behind.
About the age of 12 or 13, she started using drugs, starting hanging out with the bad crowd.
I take my part of the blame, unfortunately, but all she really wanted to do was be accepted.
Kind of got out of hand, and her mom couldn't handle it.
In an effort to help Ziana turn her life around, her family decided to make some big changes.
The only option was to turn her over to the grandma.
So they then migrated to Marietta, Georgia.
They went trying to get Ziana reestablished and put into school.
But life proved to be just as difficult in Georgia as it was in California.
She was doing really well. She had started going to school. She had stopped using drugs. But at the age of 15, she got pregnant.
Ziana decided to marry the father of her child and start a family.
There's nowhere else I want to be.
As a young mom, Ziana found what had been missing from her life.
She was so happy to be a mom. She knew this is what she wanted to do with her life.
She had her second child, and things seemed like they were going well for the two.
But after 4 years, Ziana's marriage crumbled.
Being young and then taking on additional responsibility of your children and then newly being married doesn't play well into the future.
They ended up getting divorced, and now Ziana is left with her 2 children.
That marked the beginning of a long string of failed relationships.
She was dating, but it wasn't going anywhere.
Ziana at 19 has a 3rd kid, and she and her 3rd child's father never created or maintained a relationship. And then she has another child by another person.
So by the time she's 24, she has 4 children.
As a single mom with 4 kids, life could be difficult.
Life was very stressful for her.
She's wondering, where do I turn for some relief?
Just as she was on the verge of hitting her breaking point, Ziana met someone new.
In the wake of all of that, she meets Chris Scarborough.
They actually met during Ziana's first day at her new job.
You gotta get it up here against the wall. No paint, no paint drip.
Ziana worked for Christopher, helping him paint.
I'll be a pro in no time, thanks to you.
Chris is from Raleigh, North Carolina, and had been living with his mother in Ackworth, which is maybe 20 minutes away.
Ziana and him hit it off.
He's a tall, dark, handsome man. He's older, more mature, and all of those things were appealing to Ziana.
Before long, their friendship blossomed into something more.
Their work relationship transitions to a more loving relationship.
Chris felt as if he wanted to be a part of not only Ziana's life, but now her 4 kids' life.
They're gonna love you. I already know.
Ziana knew she'd finally found what she was looking for.
She was just excited about what the relationship was going to bring.
But now, Marietta police are racing to Ziana's home after receiving a cryptic 911 call from an unknown source.
An anonymous call comes into 911 referencing a welfare check needing to be done at the residence.
When the police arrive, they knock on the door, and Ziana's grandmother answers.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. We're here to check on Ziana Graham. Is she here?
The grandmother was confused. She says Ziana is fine. She's asleep in her room.
Officers think it may be a prank call.
And we're sorry to bother you this late. Have a nice night.
Good night.
But as the police drive away, Ziana's grandmother gets a bad feeling.
She decides that she's gonna go check on Ziana.
Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw.
Oh, God. She found her granddaughter deceased on the ground.
Ziana!
After overcoming her rocky childhood, 24-year-old Ziana Graham found purpose and joy as the mother to 4 beautiful children.
She loved being a mom. That's what she cared about most.
She was very passionate about her children.
But that didn't mean it was easy.
She's struggling to work, provide for her children.
She really could use a hand in raising this family that she has created.
So, when she met a kind-hearted construction worker named Christopher Scarborough, it seemed like a match made in heaven.
Ziana's excited because Christopher is everything that she wanted. He was a provider, he was loving.
She loved that he was secure, he was working, he had a steady job.
He's ready to take care of her and her children.
She was hoping that this might be the one.
But now an anonymous 911 call has led Ziana's grandmother to make a horrifying discovery.
Oh, God!
When the police arrived, she turned them away initially because she didn't expect anything. But then that's when she went and discovered her granddaughter dead.
Ziana!
She then called 911 back, explaining that her granddaughter was deceased.
Marietta police quickly returned to the residence,
She's trying to get to the door.
followed by homicide detectives.
Open the door.
Ziana's grandmother and her children were obviously very upset. So detectives arranged for them to be transported back to the station while they looked through the house.
Here, get the kids out.
When you first arrive at the scene, you're gonna take a look at the body. You're gonna determine if there's any injuries.
Ziana is laying on her back. Her hands are spread beside her body. Her neck looks like it's broken. And she has broken small red blood vessels in her eyes.
It's a clear sign that Ziana's death was no accident.
Petechiae in the eye is a very clear indication of strangulation.
The big question was, who did this to her?
Hoping for a clue to her killer, officers set out to search the home.
They were going through it with a fine-tooth comb.
They're looking for, are there any signs of forced entry?
Are there weapons? Is there blood spatter? What in here is going to point us towards a suspect?
While they don't turn up any hard evidence, the investigators are able to eliminate at least one theory.
There was no signs of theft or any indication that someone wanted to break into the home.
By all indications, this wasn't a random attack. This was targeted.
But who would want to kill a doting mother like Ziana?
Police start recalling back to this very curious anonymous tip for a welfare check. They didn't want to give any identifying information.
Could the man who called 911 also be the monster who took Ziana's life?
Thank you, sir. There you go.
So they requested a trace on that mysterious 911 call to try to figure out who that was that called in for this welfare check.
While they wait for the results, detectives head to the station to speak to Ziana's family.
They want to talk to those who are in the house, including the children. But due to this traumatic experience, it may be hard to get them to say anything.
Instead, they focus their attention on Ziana's grandmother.
I know this is gonna be hard, but I gotta ask you a few questions.
Of course.
She's frantic and she's confused.
She's trying to make sense of all these crazy events that just happened in her own home.
Can you think of anyone that may have wanted to hurt Ziana?
No, I just can't understand it.
She doesn't know who could have done this to Ziana.
Her granddaughter who never met a stranger, who was everyone's friend, who always was pleasant, who always was full of life. Why would anybody want to do anything to her?
Was there anyone new in Ziana's life?
Not that I know of. Unless you mean Christopher.
She explained that she was dating a Christopher Scarborough.
She told them that he was a construction worker. He helped around the house and did little small, tighter things.
She felt that he was a great guy. He was nice to her, the children, and Ziana.
There's probably something I should tell you.
Even though grandmother thought Christopher was great, there's a concern.
She revealed that Christopher had just gotten out of jail.
After mother of four Ziana Graham was strangled to death in her home, Georgia investigators suspect the killer could be someone she knew.
They started to thinking that maybe this is personal because there was no signs of theft or forced entry.
Now, detectives have just learned that Ziana's boyfriend of 7 months, Christopher Scarborough, was released from jail just 2 weeks before she was murdered.
Of course, the detectives were concerned because he has a criminal history.
Could that have been the person who did this?
What was Christopher's relationship with Ziana like?
Good, I think. He was there for her when she needed him.
Grandmother was trying to see the best in Chris as he was helping out around the house.
He was mowing the grass, he was making repairs in the home, just taking care of everything.
He seemed to bring a sense of stability, a sense of consistency to the family structure. He was really being like a man of the house kind of figure.
When's the last time you saw Christopher?
Last night, he came by to visit Ziana for a little bit.
She shared that Ziana's boyfriend, Christopher, stays with them from time to time, and he happened to be there last night.
However, he left, and that was normal because sometimes he would go to stay with his mother in Ackworth.
He's between two different households.
What was he like when he left?
Not sure. I didn't talk to him.
Grandma was already in bed at this point, but she heard him leave out the front door.
After detectives end their interview with Ziana's grandmother, they receive word that their trace of the 911 caller's cell phone has been completed.
The number that made the call turned out to be a prepaid phone without a real name attached to it.
They were able to get a GPS position for the device that made the 911 call, and the location rang a bell for the detectives.
The 911 call had come in from Ackworth.
Since Christopher has family in Ackworth, they thought maybe that's where Christopher was.
When they arrive at the GPS coordinates, their suspicions are confirmed.
They go to Ackworth where they believe this is Christopher's mother's house. And guess what? He's there.
They let him know that they wanted to ask him questions about his girlfriend.
Initially, he was very upset. He had not heard from her, and he needed to know what was going on.
So what's he? What's the other?
He stated that he was trying to contact her. She wasn't answering the phone, so he became worried about her.
When the investigators break the news that his girlfriend is dead, Christopher seems stunned.
Chris was genuinely shocked to find out that Ziana was gone.
They had this opportunity to ask him as many questions as they need because he is being so willing and cooperative.
How's your relationship with Miss Grant? Good?
He said he loves Ziana and her kids.
How long have you and her been seeing each other? 7 months. 7 months. Mm-hmm.
They fell deep and fast for each other.
But that doesn't mean they always got along.
Have you guys ever gotten into it with each other? Yeah. I mean, everybody does, right? Sometimes.
He said, we fight, but that's normal. Most people fight in relationships.
And the night before Ziana was found dead was no exception.
He stated that very night they had gotten into an argument, and that was one of the reasons why he left.
Detectives asked, what were you arguing about?
No, you would act like this!
He stated that she was constantly picking a fight with him.
You just done? Okay. You said that argument got physical. Can you talk to me about that? Hitting me and
Get out!
But Christopher tells detectives he kept his cool.
He was thinking that it was probably in his best interest to just let her calm down and they'll have a conversation later on.
He figured he would just go to his mom's house.
So he called him a ride share and left to go back to Ackworth.
When he walked out the door, Christopher says Ziana was still alive.
How was Deanna when you left? Talking. She was talking to you when you left. Okay.
He says she was upset, but she definitely wasn't dead.
Detectives aren't sure if they can believe him, especially since they suspect he made the anonymous 911 call that led them to Ziana's body.
If he didn't know Ziana was hurt, why would he have asked for a welfare check?
When they confront Christopher with their suspicions, he gives them an answer they weren't expecting.
They decided to ask him, and he admits to making the 911 call.
But not because he knew Ziana was dead.
Christopher said Ziana had relapsed.
He said she was out of control.
After he left, she stopped answering the phone.
He was concerned, and he needed to know what was going on.
He thought she might have overdosed.
Georgia construction worker Christopher Scarborough has admitted to fighting with his girlfriend, Ziana Graham, just a few hours before she was found dead in her home.
We were just arguing.
But he insists he didn't kill her.
When he left the house, he reported she was alive and well.
Christopher claims there was another reason why he asked police to perform a welfare check on his girlfriend that night.
According to him, Ziana had started using drugs again. He stated that she was out of her mind, going crazy.
Once he left the house, she wasn't taking his calls or answering his texts, so he thought she might have OD'd or something bad might have happened.
You wanted somebody to go check on her, make sure she was okay? Yeah.
He said he was trying to help.
He didn't want Ziana to find out he called the police on her, so that's why he said he refused to give his name to the 911 operator.
The information that Ziana had a drug problem comes as a surprise to detectives.
That opened a lot of new avenues for the investigation. Was this a drug deal that went bad? Has Ziana reached out to some unknown third party while she was under the influence?
The investigators are now thinking several different outcomes could have resulted in Ziana being strangled.
On top of that, Christopher's story appears to check out.
Chris, is your mother home?
Yeah.
Whoa!
The officers look into his alibi.
Police follow up with his mom, and she does confirm that he did stay with her the night before.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks. Have a good day.
Let's get his phone records and subpoena the rideshare company.
Right.
They contact Uber, and they confirm that Christopher did leave Ziana's house that night.
The investigators thought he's told us what seems to be the truth.
With their sole suspect cut loose, the detectives start exploring other possibilities.
They want to try to track down if there's anybody that Ziana has been buying drugs from. Maybe this was a drug deal gone bad.
The detectives checked Ziana's phone records to see who she'd been in contact with.
It's another dead end.
Unfortunately, they don't find anything suspicious.
All of the numbers seem to be the regular people. Her grandmother, her friends, Christopher. There weren't any concerns for any other numbers on her phone line.
Investigators next turn to Ziana's prior romantic relationships.
Jealousy can be a huge motive when you're looking at any murder case, especially one as personal as this one appeared to be.
They know that she was married, and they know that she has children with 3 other fathers.
So investigators start to think maybe we should just follow up on these other men that are in Ziana's life, see if there was any bad blood.
After obtaining contact information from Ziana's family, the detectives start making calls.
They make contact with her ex-husband, who she has 2 kids with, and he states that he no longer lives in Georgia.
He is very active in his children's life. They have a good relationship, co-parenting.
The father of her youngest child, they co-parent very well, so he was cleared as well.
One of the fathers, on the other hand, they really don't have a great relationship.
He's not around. Maybe he's had something to do with this.
But when the detectives speak to him, they realize it's another false lead.
Turns out he has a really good alibi.
He was at work, alibi confirmed, and so he obviously could not have done this.
It's one more frustrating setback in an investigation that seems to be going nowhere.
The fathers of her children are all accounted for.
There was no evidence of a drug crime either, at least as far as the police could tell.
They don't know where to go at this point.
They were back to square one.
Homicide.
Until an unexpected new tip comes in.
They receive a call from the therapist that had been working with the children.
Officers, in order to get the interview with the children, contacted the Child Advocacy Center and scheduled for the children to be interviewed by a forensic interviewer.
The forensic interview is so there's no bias and there's no leading questions being asked to the children and kind of getting more of a truth from the children as far as what happened.
The therapist tells detectives that during her interview with Ziana's oldest son, he made a chilling statement.
He starts talking about some of the things that he remembers from the night that Ziana died.
I heard arguing and bumping noises.
Like a thud?
He had heard a loud snap.
Then, out of nowhere, he says he killed her.
Who did the snap?
Christopher.
He told the therapist that it was Christopher who killed his mother.
48 hours after Ziana Graham was found dead on the floor of her Marietta, Georgia home, the police investigation into her murder had slowed to a crawl.
It feels as if the trail is gone cold. Then they get a phone call.
The call is from a police therapist who's been working with the murdered woman's young children.
And as one of the children is talking to the therapist, he reveals a bombshell that could blow this case wide open.
Who did the snap?
Christopher.
According to her son, it was her boyfriend who killed her.
He told me it was Christopher who killed his mom.
The shocking accusation stuns law enforcement.
They had already interviewed Christopher and didn't think he had anything to do with this.
But now, they're starting to have second thoughts. Especially when they hear the full extent of what Ziana's son said.
Well, apparently, this guy had been physically abusive.
He reported that Christopher had beat her previously.
He's witnessed Christopher hit her, chase her, choke her.
Even the children weren't safe from Christopher's abuse.
According to the older son, Christopher has hit him a few times.
And on the night Ziana died, the young boy said he heard a familiar sound. His mother and Christopher fighting.
He was downstairs, he heard them arguing, heard it got physical.
He remembers hearing a loud bang and jostling, some aggressive conversation.
Then he heard a snap. And he realized that was his mom's neck breaking.
He heard from upstairs when it happened.
That trauma is something he's going to process and be with him for the rest of his life.
It's a damning allegation from an innocent child who has no reason to lie. But is it enough to draw up murder charges?
Putting a child on the stand can present many challenges when it comes to a case.
Children can have trouble separating make-believe from reality, and so their testimony, it isn't always rock solid.
Well, after finding out the information from Ziana's son,
All right, pull everything we have on him.
the detectives felt that Christopher needed to be looked at deeper.
While Christopher's abuse had slipped past Ziana's grandmother, conversations with other family members revealed they had long suspected something was wrong in the couple's relationship.
Ziana and her father had started to build their relationship better, so she told him something just was not right with Christopher.
When I found out who he was, I knew it felt wrong.
Dad had a feeling that the two of them were involved in some type of domestic violence.
But Ziana struggled to see a way out.
Ziana confided in her father and said, I want to get out of this relationship, but I don't know how.
It's very hard for folks to, once they're in a relationship, to get out of the cycle of abuse.
When detectives receive Ziana's autopsy results, they further implicate her boyfriend.
It was determined that she didn't have any drugs in her system. She had been drinking, but it wasn't a large amount of alcohol.
That means Christopher was lying about Ziana using cocaine. Why would he do that? Unless, of course, he was trying to lead the police down a false trail.
At this point, they're definitely sure that it's him.
But what had pushed Christopher past the point of no return?
What set him off? Did Ziana finally tell him she was leaving him?
The investigators have a whole lot of new questions that need to be answered.
To their surprise, Christopher freely agrees to come in for a follow-up interview.
They tell him that they found some new information that they just want to confirm.
All right, Chris. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what we talked about earlier. Okay. We talked about the altercation that you and Mr. Graham had. You said that you were in the bedroom. Could you kind of go through that again with me?
Christopher begins by telling the investigators the same thing he told them last time.
He's still sticking to his story that they got into it, he left.
Okay. When the incident got physical, do you remember how it got physical or how it started? See, grab something in your face. Is that how you got the little mark on your cheek right here? No, yeah. Yeah? What did she swing at you, you know? I don't know. I was gonna take you to it.
They pressed him for more information. What were you two fighting about that night?
Christopher seems reluctant to answer, but when he finally does, it's clear why.
You can start to see a shift in his personality.
You didn't tell me what the argument was about last night. No, it wasn't. What? About their boyfriend.
As evidence piled up against him, Christopher Scarborough continued to claim innocence in the murder of his 24-year-old girlfriend, Ziana Graham.
He's sticking with his story. Yes, we were arguing, but when I left the house, she was fine. She was alive.
But now he just admitted the shocking reason why he and Ziana were fighting. She had gotten an abortion without telling him.
Mr. Scarborough and Ziana had started dating approximately 7 months prior to this incident.
While they were together, Ziana got pregnant.
Christopher was very excited about the pregnancy. It would have been his first biological child.
But instead of celebrating new life, Christopher found himself mourning what could have been.
Ziana told him that she had lost a baby.
You said it was a miscarriage? A miscarriage.
He soon learned that was a lie.
He had gotten a Facebook message from someone very close to Ziana.
Tell me how Ziana got her abortion.
That's how he found out that it was an abortion and not a miscarriage. And that's what triggered him.
You said that you guys got in this argument. Yeah. And then it was over the incident with her, with the abortion incident, right? Yeah.
He said he may have overreacted.
I can't believe you went behind my back.
I didn't go behind your back.
Yes, you did.
I did what was best for me.
About mine?
He was really, really upset about this.
But he insists he didn't kill Ziana until detectives start to roll out the evidence against him.
They hit him with the abuse and the statement from Ziana's oldest son.
They said, Christopher, we know you've done this. You need to come clean.
When you left there, she wasn't talking to you. And you know that. You knew it all along. I just need to know what happened. I know that you grabbed her on the neck. I know that. Can you tell me what happened? Did you throw her on the ground?
Christopher reported that Ziana was very angry that night. She was yelling, screaming. She hit him with a toy, and he was trying to calm her down. So the way he thought to calm her down was just to restrain her.
You just grabbed her. How'd you grab her? Like this?
That's why I didn't tell you the truth, because I knew you would act like this.
She was pulling away from him, resisting him.
He admitted to putting his hands around her neck.
So you grabbed her on the neck. Did you squeeze her hard? Yeah. Do you remember how long you choked her?
Christopher began to cry, and he did admit that he strangled Ziana until he heard her neck break.
He said that he recognized that she was dead, lying on the floor, before he left the house and went to his mother's.
It's all the investigators need to hear.
At this point, the investigators have a full confession. They understand what happened, and Chris has admitted his role in Ziana's death. And they charge him with aggravated assault, malice murder, and cruelty to children because her 4 children were present at the home when all of this happened.
Christopher is left with few options.
Given all the evidence against him, given the fact that he has now confessed to his role in Ziana's death, it's starting to ring true that he will probably get whatever penalties are coming to him.
He talks to his attorney and finds out, because of his lengthy criminal history, that with this additional charge, it's possible for him to go to prison for life without parole. And he doesn't want that.
So he decides to cut a deal.
Christopher decided to take a plea deal instead of going to trial.
He pleads to malice murder and cruelty to children in the 3rd degree.
He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole.
For Ziana's family, it's too little, too late.
I would have rather him gone to trial. I realized that now that he confessed and turned himself in and all that, his punishment could be a little bit less. That upsets me. Of course, it would upset anybody.
The good news is, because of those felonies on his record, the possibility that he'll get parole is likely none.
In Georgia, he'd have to serve a minimum of 30 years before he would be eligible for parole. Ultimately, it's up to the parole board as to whether he will ever parole out.
Whether or not Christopher is ever released from prison, his violent actions will never stop reverberating through the lives of Ziana Graham's children.
They were in the house when it happened, and this is going to live with them for the rest of their life.
Those children, they never forget, that trauma follows them throughout their lives.
This was so much more than one murder. In a lot of ways, this was the destruction of an entire family.
I miss her so much. It's been a lot of work, a lot of counselors, a lot of therapy. I want her to know that I'm doing the best. I'm doing the best I can with the kids, and I hope they're happy. I hope they know love. I hope they know how much their mother loved them. And she did. She loved them very much.
On the morning of November 15th, 1959, Holcomb, Kansas, was still the kind of place where a family could disappear from its usual routine and the absence would be noticed. Holcomb was a small farming community in western Kansas, a place where people knew one another and where the ordinary rhythms of life could seem almost permanent. The Clutter family lived on a farm outside the town, and to those who knew them, their household was not a place associated with danger, scandal, or violence. Herbert William Herb Clutter was 48 years old. He was a successful farmer, a disciplined man, and someone who had earned a respected position within his community. His wife, Bonnie, was 45. Their two younger children, 16-year-old Nancy and 15-year-old Kenyon, still lived at home. Their two older daughters had already moved away. Nothing about the family, at least from what was known, suggested that they were about to become the victims of one of the most notorious crimes in 20th century American history. Yet by the time that November morning was over, all four would be dead. They had not been killed in a public place, during a robbery that had gone wrong in the open, or in some confrontation witnessed by strangers. They had been murdered inside their own home. That single fact would be enough to disturb the sense of security that surrounded Holcomb. But the questions that followed made the crime even more difficult to understand. Who would want the Clutter family dead? Why this family? Why Herbert, a respected farmer? Why Bonnie? Why Nancy and Kenyon, teenagers whose lives had barely begun? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why would anyone kill four people who appeared to have no personal connection to the men who would eventually be identified as their killers? The names Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith would soon become permanently connected to the Clutter murders. But on the morning the bodies were discovered, those names meant nothing to the people of Holcomb. There was no obvious answer waiting for investigators. There was only a house for victims, and the terrible realization that someone had entered the family's private world during the night and destroyed it. The investigation would eventually reveal that the murders had not begun with hatred toward the Clutters. They had begun with a story about money, a story that was wrong. Richard Hickok had once been incarcerated with a man named Floyd Wells. Wells had previously worked for Herbert Clutter, and during their time together, he told Hickok about the Clutter household. According to the information Hickok received, Herbert Clutter supposedly kept a safe containing around $10,000 in cash. For Hickok, that figure became more than a detail from someone else's past. It became an opportunity. The problem was that the information was false. Herbert Clutter did not keep a vast reserve of cash in his home as Hickok imagined. He primarily used checks and ordinary methods of payment, and there was no $10,000 fortune waiting inside the house. But Hickok did not know that. After his release from prison, he contacted Perry Smith, another former inmate, and the two decided to carry out the robbery. Their initial objective was straightforward: enter the Clutter home, find the money, and leave. There was no reason, in the information available to us, to believe that they began with a plan to eliminate an entire family. Yet that distinction would soon become horrifyingly important. A plan built around a false assumption was about to collide with four real human lives. On the night of November 15th, Hickok and Smith drove toward the Clutter farm. They were armed. They entered the house with the intention of finding the money they believed was there. But the expected safe did not appear. The $10,000 did not appear either. The foundation of the entire plan was simply not real. At that point, they could have left. They could have abandoned the robbery when they discovered that the information was wrong. Instead, the situation moved in a far more terrible direction. The two men restrained the members of the Clutter family. The telephone was cut. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were separated and held in different areas of the house. What had begun as an attempt to steal money had become a crime in which the victims were no longer free to leave, call for help, or protect themselves. Herbert was taken to the basement. Kenyon was also held in the basement area. Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. According to the later confessions and the information contained in the case record, Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings, while Hickok participated in the plan and was present at the scene. One by one, the four members of the Clutter family were murdered with a shotgun. The violence ended the lives of a father, a mother, a daughter, and a son who had been living an ordinary family life only hours earlier. And yet, after the killings, the supposed fortune still did not exist. The men took only a small amount of property, including a few dollars in objects such as a radio and binoculars. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend, for people had been killed because two men believed there was a large amount of money inside the house. That money had never been there. The morning after the murders, the quiet of Holcomb was broken by the discovery that something was terribly wrong at the Clutter home. The family's absence from its normal routine became impossible to ignore, and eventually the 4 bodies were discovered. Authorities were called. What investigators found was not simply a homicide. It was the destruction of an entire household. The questions multiplied immediately. If the motive had been revenge, where was the history of conflict? If the motive had been robbery, why had the entire family been killed? And if the killers had come for money, why had they left with so little? The Kansas Bureau of Investigation became involved, and the case quickly developed into a major investigation. The community wanted answers, but at first there were very few. The Clutters had not been known as people surrounded by enemies. There was no clear personal connection between the victims and the eventual suspects. Investigators were faced with a crime that seemed both deliberate and senseless. Somewhere behind it was a motive, and somewhere behind that motive was the person who had first decided that the Clutter home was worth entering. The answer would eventually lead investigators backward, away from the farm and into the past of a man named Richard Hickok. It would lead them to a former prisoner who suddenly realized that something he had once said could have helped set the murders in motion. His name was Floyd Wells, and when Wells learned what had happened to the Clutter family, he remembered the conversation he had once had with Hickok. That memory would become the first major break in a case that, for a time, seemed to have no beginning and no end. The 4 victims were dead. The killers had already left Kansas. But the investigation was only beginning, and the path toward the truth would start with a story about $10,000 that had never existed. Before the Clutter family became names in a murder investigation, they were simply a family living their lives in rural Kansas. That distinction matters, because the story of the Clutter murders can easily become dominated by the men who committed the crime. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, their criminal histories, their confessions, their trial, and eventually their executions. But before any of that, there were 4 people whose lives had nothing to do with the men who would kill them. Herbert William Clutter was 48 years old. His wife, Bonnie, was 45. Their daughter Nancy was 16, and their son Kenyon was 15. They lived together on a farm near Holcomb, in western Kansas, where the landscape and the rhythm of everyday life were shaped by agriculture and by the familiarity of a small community. Herbert was a successful farmer and a respected figure among the people who knew him. He was described as disciplined and principled, someone who had established a good reputation through his work and his conduct. There is no indication in the information available for this account that Herbert was involved in a personal conflict with Richard Hickok or Perry Smith. In fact, the 2 men were essentially strangers to the family. That absence of a relationship would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. In many murders, investigators begin by looking at the victims' relationships. They ask who might have had a reason to be angry, who might have wanted revenge, who might have benefited from a death, or who might have been involved in a long-running dispute. With the Clutters, there was no obvious explanation of that kind. Herbert was not known as someone surrounded by enemies. The family did not appear to be living under a threat. There was no apparent feud that could explain why 4 members of the household would be attacked. Together, their lives seemed ordinary, and that ordinariness made what happened to them even harder for the community to comprehend. Bonnie Clutter, Herbert's wife, was 45. She shared the family home with her husband and their 2 younger children. Nancy and Kenyon were the youngest members of the household. Nancy was 16, old enough to have her own interests and routines, but still very much a teenager living under her parents' roof. Kenyon was 15, only a year younger. Their two older sisters had already moved away, leaving Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon as the four members of the immediate family still living together. This detail is important because it explains the shape of the household on the night of November 15th, 1959. It was not a house filled with strangers or visitors. It was a family home occupied by parents and two teenage children. The older daughters were elsewhere, living their own lives, while Nancy and Kenyon remained at home. In the days before the murders, there was no reason for the family to believe that their home had become a target. The danger was not something they had been preparing for. It was not an enemy they could see approaching. The threat came from two men whose names were not part of their daily lives. That is what makes the later events so difficult to reduce to a simple motive. Hickok and Smith did not arrive because of something Nancy had done, or because Kenyon had offended them, or because Bonnie or Herbert had been involved in a personal dispute with either man. They came because Hickok believed there was money inside the house. That belief had originated with information from Floyd Wells, a man who had previously worked for Herbert Clutter and who had later shared a prison cell with Hickok. Wells had told Hickok that Clutter supposedly had a safe containing approximately $10,000 in cash. For Hickok, the figure transformed the Clutter home into a potential target. Yet the family themselves had no knowledge of the plan being formed around them. The supposed fortune was not sitting in their house waiting to be taken. Herbert primarily used checks and ordinary methods of payment, and there was no $10,000 cash reserve hidden in a safe. The entire premise of the robbery was based on a misunderstanding. But to understand why that misunderstanding became so deadly, it is necessary to look at the lives and choices of the two men who acted upon it. Richard Eugene Hickok had a criminal background and had spent time in prison. During that period, he met Floyd Wells. When Hickok eventually left prison, he carried with him the information Wells had provided about the Clutter family. He then contacted Perry Edward Smith, another former inmate. Together, they decided to carry out the robbery. From the information available, the initial plan was not described as an elaborate campaign against the Clutters. It was presented as something much simpler. Enter the home, locate the money, take it, and leave. The men believed that a large amount of cash would make the risk worthwhile. They did not understand that the foundation of their plan was false. They also did not appear to understand the terrible consequences that could follow once they entered the home and discovered that the expected money was not there. That night, the people inside the house remained unaware of the assumptions that had brought two armed men to their property. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were not participants in a criminal dispute. They were not rivals of Hickok and Smith. They were simply the people who happened to live in the house the two men had selected. The absence of a personal connection between victim and killer would later become one of the defining features of the case. It meant that the Clutter family had not been chosen because of who they were as individuals. They had been chosen because of what one man believed they possessed. And when that belief proved false, the lives of four innocent people were still destroyed. The Clutter home, therefore, became more than the setting of a crime. It became the place where an imagined fortune collided with reality. Hickok and Smith expected to find $10,000. Instead, they found a family. The decision that followed would determine the fate of every person inside the house. The four members of the Clutter family were restrained. Their telephone was cut, separating the household from the outside world. Herbert was taken to the basement, and Kenyon was also held in the basement area. Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. The family was no longer in control of what happened inside their own home. According to the later confessions and the case information, Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings, while Hickok remained involved in the plan and present at the scene. One by one, Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were killed with a shotgun. The exact sequence of the violence is less important than what the event represented, for separate lives were ended in a place where those people should have been safest. Herbert, who had built a life around his farm and his reputation, would not see another morning. Bonnie would not leave the home again. Nancy, at 16, would never reach adulthood. Kenyon, 15, would never have the chance to grow into the future that had been waiting for him. Their lives ended not because of something they had done, but because two men believed that money was hidden in their house. And when the supposed money turned out not to exist, the loss became even more senseless. The Clutter family had been transformed from a living household into the center of a criminal investigation almost overnight. Their home, once associated with ordinary family life, became the scene of a crime that would soon draw the attention of investigators, the courts, journalists, and eventually the wider American public. Yet on that first morning, before the case acquired its famous names and before the story reached books and headlines, there were only 4 victims and a community trying to understand what had happened. The question remained, why had someone chosen the Clutter home? The answer would not come from the family's history. It would come from the history of a man who had once worked for Herbert, a man who had shared information in prison, and who would soon realize that his words might have helped point 2 killers toward an innocent family. That man was Floyd Wells, and his decision to speak would provide investigators with the first real path toward Richard Hickok and, eventually, Perry Smith. The Clutter family had no idea that, long before Richard Hickok and Perry Smith ever approached their home, a story about them had already begun moving through the life of another man. That story concerned money. More precisely, it concerned the belief that Herbert Clutter possessed $10,000 in cash, supposedly kept inside a safe at his home. The information would prove to be false, but by the time anyone discovered that, it would have already done its damage. The chain of events began with Richard Eugene Hickok during a period when he was incarcerated. Hickok had spent time in prison, and while there he became acquainted with Floyd Wells, a man who had previously worked for Herbert Clutter. Wells knew something about the Clutter household. At some point during their time together, he told Hickok that Clutter had a safe containing approximately $10,000 in cash. For Wells, the information was simply something he shared with a fellow prisoner. For Hickok, it became an idea. $10,000 was an enormous temptation for a man thinking about crime. The Clutter home suddenly appeared to represent an opportunity, a successful farmer, a supposed safe, and a large amount of cash waiting to be taken. But the crucial detail was that the safe and the fortune supposedly inside it did not exist in the way Hickok imagined. Herbert Clutter did not maintain a hidden reserve of $10,000 in cash. He primarily used checks and ordinary forms of payment. There was no vast pile of money waiting for someone to discover it. The robbery plan was therefore built upon a false premise from the beginning. Yet Hickok did not know that. When he was released from prison, the information remained with him. Instead of forgetting the story, he acted on it. He contacted Perry Edward Smith, another former inmate, and the 2 men decided to carry out the robbery together. Their objective, at least as described in the available information, was straightforward. They intended to enter the Clutter home, find the supposed money, take it, and leave. There was no indication in the initial plan that they intended to carry out the destruction of an entire family. The imagined robbery was supposed to be quick. The men believed that they knew what they were looking for. They believed there was a safe. They believed there was $10,000 inside it. And they believed that once they had taken the money, the matter would be over. Every one of those assumptions would prove important, because a criminal plan can depend upon facts that are not facts at all. Hickok and Smith were not responding to a real fortune they had seen. They were responding to a story. They were not targeting the Clutters because of a personal conflict. They were targeting the house because Hickok believed that something valuable was inside. The 4 people who lived there were, in the most disturbing sense, incidental to the plan. Herbert was the person whose supposed wealth attracted attention. Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were members of the household. None of them had a personal relationship with either of the men preparing to enter their home. That absence of familiarity would make the eventual murders especially difficult to understand. There was no old argument waiting to explode. No personal betrayal had brought the 2 men to the farm. No feud had been building between the two sides. Instead, the Clutter family had become the target of an imagined opportunity. Hickok and Smith eventually set out for the Clutter farm on the night of November 15, 1959. They drove toward the property carrying weapons. Somewhere behind them was the assumption that the house contained a substantial amount of cash. Ahead of them was a family preparing to spend an ordinary night at home. The difference between those two realities was enormous. Hickok and Smith knew they were approaching the house for a criminal purpose. The Clutters did not know that anyone was coming. The men entered the home intending to locate the money. But the moment they began searching, the central assumption of their plan began to collapse. There was no safe containing the $10,000 they expected. The money they had come for was simply not there. This should have been the natural end of the plan. If the purpose of the journey had been robbery, and the expected money did not exist, the rational choice would have been to leave. But the situation did not end there. Instead, the absence of the money became part of the tragedy. The two men remained inside the home and began to control the people who lived there. The telephone was cut, cutting the household off from the outside world. The four members of the Clutter family were restrained and held in different parts of the house. Herbert was taken to the basement. Kenyon was also held in the basement area. Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. At that point, the character of the crime had changed completely. The men had entered looking for property. Now they were holding human beings captive. The Clutters were no longer simply people whose house had been entered. They were prisoners inside their own home. They had no control over what was happening and no immediate way to call for assistance. The supposed robbery had become a situation in which the lives of four people depended upon the decisions of two armed intruders. The later confessions would establish that Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings. Hickok, however, had participated in the plan and was present at the scene. That distinction would become significant when responsibility for the crime was examined. The men had arrived together. They had shared the intention to rob the home. They had remained after the expected money failed to appear. And they had allowed the situation to continue until four members of the family were dead. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. The victims were killed even though the original object of the crime had never existed. Herbert Clutter was killed. Bonnie Clutter was killed. Nancy Clutter was killed. Kenyon Clutter was killed. A family of four disappeared in a single night. The weapon used was a shotgun. According to the later confessions and the information contained in the case record, Smith carried out most of the actual killings. Yet the larger responsibility for the event could not be reduced to the person who physically pulled the trigger. Hickok had helped create the plan that brought them there. He had believed the story about the money. He had recruited Smith. He had gone with him to the house, and he remained present while the robbery turned into murder. Afterward, the supposed reward for the crime remained painfully small. The men took only a limited amount of property, including a few dozen dollars in items such as a radio and binoculars. There was no fortune. There was no hidden safe filled with cash. There was no $10,000 prize waiting at the end of the night. The entire foundation of the crime had been an error. Yet the consequences of that error were irreversible. For people were dead, and nothing the killers had taken could possibly justify the loss. The story of the missing fortune would later become central to understanding the motive. It explained why the men had selected the Clutter home, but it did not explain why they continued after discovering that the money was not there. That question would remain one of the darkest parts of the case. Why, after the central purpose of the robbery had disappeared, did the killing continue? The answer would eventually emerge through the investigation and the confessions of the two men. But on the night itself, the Clutters could not know what was driving their attackers. They could only experience the sudden collapse of safety inside their own home. The men who had entered as robbers had become killers. And when they finally left, they carried away only a small amount of property while leaving behind the devastation of an entire family. Their journey away from Kansas would begin soon afterward. But the investigation had not yet connected their names to the crime. For the people of Holcomb, there was still no clear suspect, no obvious motive, and no explanation for why the Clutter family had been chosen. The answer would eventually come from a man who had not been at the crime scene at all. Floyd Wells, the former worker who had once known Herbert Clutter, would hear about the murders and remember something he had told Richard Hickok. That memory would transform a rumor about a safe into the first major clue in a murder. Investigation. The night of November 15, 1959, began with an ordinary family inside an ordinary home. But it would end with 4 lives extinguished and an entire community struggling to understand what had happened. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had come to the Clutter property because of a belief that had followed Hickok out of prison. Somewhere inside the home was supposedly a safe containing $10,000 in cash. That belief was wrong. Herbert Clutter did not possess the fortune Hickok imagined, and there was no hidden reserve of $10,000 waiting for the men who had come to take it. But they did not know that when they approached the house. They came armed, carrying with them a plan that was supposed to be simple. Enter the home, locate the money, take it, and leave. What happened instead would become one of the most infamous family murders in American history. The Clutter household consisted of 4 people that night. Herbert William Clutter was 48 years old. His wife, Bonnie, was 45. Their daughter Nancy was 16, and their son Kenyon was 15. Their 2 older daughters had already moved away. So these were the 4 members of the immediate family still living in the home. Nothing in the information surrounding the case suggests that they were expecting trouble. There was no known personal conflict between the family and the 2 men approaching them. Hickok and Smith were essentially strangers to the Clutters. The family had not been selected because of a feud, a personal betrayal, or some known dispute. They had been selected because of what Hickok believed was inside their house. That distinction would become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. The men entered the home intending to find the money. But once inside, the reality was immediately different from the expectation. There was no $10,000 fortune waiting for them. There was no large cash reserve that could justify the risk they had taken. The information Hickok had received from Floyd Wells had led him to the wrong conclusion. The supposed safe was not there in the way he had imagined, and the money was not there either. At that moment, the original purpose of the journey had effectively collapsed. They had come for something that did not exist. Yet instead of leaving, Hickok and Smith remained inside the home. The situation escalated. The 4 members of the Clutter family were restrained. Their telephone was cut, removing a direct means of contacting the outside world. The family members were held in different parts of the house. Herbert was taken to the basement. Kenyon was also held in the basement area. Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. The house, which had been the family's private space, was transformed into the setting of a crime from which none of them could simply walk away. The men who had entered looking for property now controlled 4 human beings. This was the moment when the robbery became something far more terrible. The Clutters were not merely victims of a burglary. They were being held captive inside their own home by 2 armed men. The telephone had been cut, leaving them isolated. They were restrained, separated from one another, and placed in different areas of the house. The available information does not provide a complete account of every moment that passed during this period, and it is important not to invent dialogue or private thoughts that were never recorded. What is known is enough to understand the basic reality. For members of one family were placed under the control of 2 intruders, and before the night was over, all 4 would be dead. Herbert Clutter, the father, had been the person whose supposed wealth attracted the attention of the killers. Yet the violence did not stop with him. Bonnie, his wife, was also killed. Nancy and Kenyon, their teenage children, were also killed. Their ages make the destruction particularly stark. Nancy was 16. Kenyon was 15. They were not people with any known connection to the criminal plan. They were simply members of the family living in the house that had become the target of the robbery. According to the later confessions and the information contained in the case record, Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings. Hickok, however, was not an uninvolved bystander. He had participated in the plan. He had come to the house with Smith. He was present at the scene. The distinction between the man who physically carried out most of the killings and the man who participated in the criminal plan would later become important in the legal proceedings. But it did not change the fundamental reality of what happened that night. The two men had arrived together, and the robbery had become a mass killing. The victims were killed with a shotgun. The violence took place within the house, in different areas where the family had been restrained. Herbert was killed in the basement area. Kenyon was also held there. Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. One by one, the members of the family lost their lives. The crime was therefore not a single sudden act that happened in one moment. It was a sequence in which the household was gradually emptied of its living members. By the time Hickok and Smith were finished, there was no one left alive in the Clutter home. And still, the money they had come for had not appeared. This is one of the central contradictions of the case. The men had taken an enormous risk because they believed $10,000 was waiting for them. But there was no $10,000. The expected reward did not exist. What they ultimately took was a comparatively small amount of property, including a few dozen dollars in items such as a radio and binoculars. The contrast between what they believed they would gain and what they actually took was enormous. For people were dead, and the supposed fortune had never been there in the first place. The tragedy, therefore, cannot be separated from the false information that initiated the crime. But the false information alone does not explain everything. It explains why the Clutter home became a target. It explains why Hickok believed the robbery was worth attempting. It does not explain why, after the money failed to appear, the men did not simply leave. That question would remain central to the case and would later be examined through their statements. In the investigation, what is certain is that the Clutter family paid the ultimate price for a plan they had no part in creating. Herbert had not invited these men into his home. Bonnie had no connection to their criminal plans. Nancy and Kenyon had no role in the supposed fortune that attracted the killers. Yet all four were killed. Eventually, Hickok and Smith left the property. The crime was over, but its consequences were only beginning. The men would leave Kansas, while behind them the Clutter home contained the evidence of what had happened. The family's normal life had ended in a single night. The following morning, people who knew the Clutters would begin to realize that something was wrong. The household that had once contained 4 living people was suddenly silent. That silence would soon be broken by discovery. For the community of Holcomb, the question would not simply be who had committed the murders. It would be why anyone would want to destroy this particular family. At first, there was no clear answer. There was no obvious enemy, no established personal motive, and no immediate connection between the Clutters and the men who had entered their home. The investigation would have to begin almost from nothing. Investigators would have to reconstruct the final hours of 4 people whose lives had been taken from them and determine why their house had been selected. They would have to understand what the killers had been searching for and what had gone wrong. And somewhere beyond the crime scene, 2 men who had believed they could enter the Clutter home, take money, and disappear were already moving away from Kansas. The night of November 15th had ended, but the investigation had not yet truly begun. The next chapter would start with a terrible discovery in the Clutter home and a town confronting the realization that 4 of its own had been murdered. Before investigators could find Hickok and Smith, they first had to understand the victims, the scene, and the strange absence of any obvious reason for the crime. The answer was there, but it was buried beneath the silence left behind in the house. The night had ended, but for the people of Holcomb, the most difficult part was only beginning. On November 15th, 1959, the Clutter home no longer contained the ordinary sounds and routines of a family of 4. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were dead, and the men responsible had already left the property. At first, however, the people around them did not know that. The Clutter family had been part of a familiar rhythm, and when that rhythm was suddenly broken, the absence became noticeable. The family had not simply disappeared into another town. Something was wrong inside the house. Eventually, the 4 members of the family were discovered dead, and authorities were called. The discovery transformed what might initially have seemed like an unexplained absence into something far more disturbing. An entire family had been killed inside their own home. For the community of Holcomb, the shock was difficult to separate from the nature of the victims themselves. Herbert Clutter was a respected farmer. Bonnie was his wife. Nancy was 16 years old. Kenyon was 15. They were not known as people living under a serious threat. There was no obvious public conflict surrounding the family. No known feud that could immediately explain why someone would enter their home and kill every member of the household. The discovery, therefore, created a question that would dominate the investigation from the beginning. Why the Clutters? Investigators had to confront a crime in which the victims seemed to have been selected without an apparent personal motive. Herbert was not known to have a significant conflict with the people who would eventually be identified as his killers. Bonnie had no known connection to them. Nancy and Kenyon were teenagers whose deaths appeared even more difficult to explain. The family had been caught inside a crime that seemed to have been directed at the household as a whole. The circumstances inside the home provided investigators with important clues about what had happened. The telephone had been cut, and the victims had been restrained. They had been held in different areas of the house. Herbert and Kenyon had been held in the basement area, while Bonnie and Nancy had been kept in bedrooms. The arrangement indicated that the perpetrators had taken control of the household rather than simply entering, taking property, and leaving immediately. Something had happened between the moment the men entered the house and the moment they finally left. That difference was crucial. If the crime had been a simple burglary, investigators might have expected the intruders to take property and escape. Instead, 4 people had been killed. The Clutter home had become the scene of a deliberate and devastating act of violence. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation became involved in the case. Investigators faced an enormous problem. There was no obvious suspect. The family did not appear to have been targeted because of a known personal dispute. If the murders were an act of revenge, investigators needed to discover what conflict could have led to such a crime. If the murders were connected to robbery, they needed to determine what the killers had been looking for. And if robbery had been the motive, another question immediately followed. Why had 4 people been killed when the family apparently did not possess the fortune that a robber might have expected? The investigation therefore required investigators to look beyond the immediate scene. They had to examine the family's background and determine whether anyone had a reason to harm Herbert Clutter or the other members of the household. They also had to consider whether the crime had been committed by people who knew the family or by strangers who had chosen the property for some other reason. The lack of an obvious connection made the case particularly unsettling. There was no clear trail leading directly from the victims to their killers. The men who had committed the murders were already gone. They were not waiting nearby to be identified. They had left Kansas, and the investigation had to begin reconstructing their actions from the evidence and information available. The question of money would eventually become essential. The investigators would learn that the crime had been connected to a belief that Herbert Clutter kept approximately $10,000 in cash inside a safe. But that belief was false. Herbert primarily used checks and ordinary payment methods, and there was no hidden $10,000 fortune inside the home. The supposed wealth had come from information associated with Floyd Wells, a former employee of Herbert Clutter who had also spent time in prison with Richard Hickok. At this stage, however, investigators did not yet have the complete chain of events. They did not yet know that a conversation between 2 prisoners would eventually connect the Clutter family to 2 men traveling far away from Kansas. They only knew that 4 people were dead and that someone had entered their home with a purpose. The absence of a large amount of stolen money created another contradiction. A robbery normally has a clear objective. The thief wants property, and the crime is driven by the value of what can be taken. Here, the expected reward was missing. The men had reportedly taken only a small amount of property. including a few dozen dollars in objects such as a radio and binoculars. The amount was insignificant compared with the supposed $10,000 fortune that had inspired the crime. Investigators, therefore, had to consider a possibility that would later prove central to the case. Perhaps the killers had entered the home expecting something that was never there. If that were true, the murders were even more difficult to comprehend. For lives had been destroyed because of an expectation that had no basis in reality. The investigation gradually began to move away from the idea that the family itself was the key to the motive. Instead, attention turned toward the people who might have known about the household and its supposed wealth. That was the beginning of the path that would eventually lead to Floyd Wells. Wells was not one of the killers. He was not present at the Clutter home on the night of the murders. But he had once worked for Herbert Clutter, and he had once shared information about the family with Richard Hickok. The significance of that connection would only become clear after Wells heard about the killings. At first, however, the investigation remained open. The community waited for answers while authorities worked to identify whoever had entered the Clutter home. The case had the characteristics of a crime that could easily remain unsolved for victims, no obvious personal motive, and perpetrators who had already fled. The longer the investigation continued without an arrest, the more questions the community would have. Yet the investigators were not simply searching for a random stranger. They were trying to reconstruct the logic of the crime. Someone had believed the Clutter home contained something worth stealing. Someone had acted upon that belief. Someone had then remained in the house even after the expected reward failed to appear. And someone had ultimately killed 4 people. Each of those facts had to be connected. The Clutter family could not explain why they had been chosen. The answer would have to come from outside their lives. It would come from the past of a man who had once known Herbert and who had unknowingly passed information to another man. When Floyd Wells eventually learned what had happened, he remembered Richard Hickok. He remembered the story he had told him about the Clutter household. He began to understand that the information he had shared might have played a role in the murders. That realization would become the first major break in the investigation. For the first time, the case would have a name attached to it that was not one of the victims. Richard Hickok would emerge as a possible suspect, and from Hickok, investigators would eventually reach Perry Smith. But that breakthrough had not happened yet. In the immediate aftermath, Holcomb was still facing the reality of what had been lost. A family of 4 had been destroyed in a single night, and the people who had done it were somewhere beyond the town. The silence of the Clutter home had become the center of a criminal investigation, while the community waited for an explanation that had not yet arrived. The answer would not come from a dramatic eyewitness or a stranger appearing with a confession. It would begin with a memory, one man remembering a conversation he had once considered unimportant. That memory would turn the investigation in a new direction and finally give authorities a reason to look beyond Holcomb, toward Richard Hickok and the man who had accompanied him, Perry Smith. For several weeks after the murders, the Clutter case remained a crime without a clear face. For people had been killed inside their own home, yet the men responsible were already far away. The investigators knew that the crime had been deliberate, that the victims had been restrained, that the telephone had been cut, and that the killers had been searching for money that was not there. But knowing what had happened was not the same as knowing who had done it. The central question remained the same: who had chosen the Clutter family and why? The answer began with a man who had not been present on the night of November 15th. His name was Floyd Wells. Wells had previously worked for Herbert Clutter, and he had also spent time in prison with Richard Hickok. During that time, Wells had told Hickok that Herbert Clutter supposedly kept a safe containing approximately $10,000 in cash. At the time, Wells could not have known that this information would become connected to a crime of extraordinary violence. But after the Clutter family was murdered, the memory of that conversation acquired an entirely different meaning. Wells knew that Hickok had heard about the supposed money. He also remembered that Hickok had been interested in the possibility of robbing the Clutter home. When Wells learned that 4 members of the family had been killed, he began to recognize a possible connection. The information he had once passed along casually could have provided the motive for someone to target the house. Wells was not the person responsible for the murders, but his memory offered investigators something they desperately needed: a direction. He contacted the authorities and told them what he remembered. His information placed Richard Hickok within the developing story of the Clutter murders. The investigation could now move beyond the question of the victims and toward the history of a possible suspect. Hickok had been in prison with Wells. He had heard about the Clutter household. He had learned about the supposed $10,000 safe. After his release, he had contacted Perry Edward Smith, another former inmate. The 2 men had decided to carry out a robbery. That connection was critical because it explained how 2 men who were essentially strangers to the Clutter family could have known enough about the household to select it as a target. They had not needed a personal relationship with Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, or Kenyon. They needed only to believe that money was waiting inside the house. The investigators now had a possible explanation for the otherwise mysterious choice of victims. The crime appeared to have begun with a false belief about Herbert Clutter's wealth. Hickok had believed that $10,000 was hidden in the home. He had acted on that belief and brought Smith into the plan. Together, they had traveled to the Clutter property, entered the house, and eventually killed all 4 members of the family. The question now was where Hickok and Smith had gone after leaving Kansas. They had not remained near the crime scene. They had moved away, creating distance between themselves and the place where the murders had occurred. Their departure did not erase the connection investigators were beginning to establish, but it meant that the investigation had to follow them beyond Holcomb. The authorities had to determine where the 2 men were and bring them back to Kansas. The case was no longer simply a search for an unknown killer. It had become a search for 2 specific men whose histories appeared to intersect with the motive behind the murders. The trail eventually led to Las Vegas, Nevada. On December 30th, 1959, approximately 6 weeks after the Clutter family had been killed, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were arrested. The arrest marked a major turning point in the investigation. For the first time, the men suspected of carrying out the crime were in custody. The distance between the crime scene and the suspects had been closed. The investigators could now question the 2 men directly and attempt to establish what had happened on the night of November 15th. But an arrest was not the same as a confession, and the authorities still had to establish the facts of the case. Hickok and Smith did not immediately provide a complete account of the murders. At first, they attempted to deny their involvement. The investigators, therefore, had to continue questioning them and confront them with the evidence that connected them to the crime. The case had already developed a powerful chain of circumstances. Hickok had learned about the supposed Clutter fortune from Wells. He had contacted Smith. The 2 men had planned a robbery. The Clutter family had been murdered, and Hickok and Smith had subsequently left Kansas. Now the investigators needed to turn that chain into a complete account. The questioning would become especially important because the responsibility for the murders would later be discussed through the statements of the 2 men themselves. Hickok eventually began to confess. His account attempted to place much of the direct responsibility for the killings on Perry Smith. According to Hickok's statement, Smith was the person who actually killed the members of the Clutter family. But Hickok's own involvement could not simply disappear. He had participated in the robbery plan. He had gone with Smith to the Clutter home. He had been present during the crime. The distinction between direct physical responsibility and participation in the larger criminal plan would become important during the legal proceedings. But the investigation had now reached a decisive stage. Hickok's confession provided investigators with information about what had happened, and Smith subsequently gave his own confession. The 2 statements became part of the case record. Through those confessions, the investigators could begin to reconstruct the crime from the perspective of the people who had committed it. The supposed $10,000 safe had been central to the plan, but it had not existed. The men had entered the home expecting money and instead found that the information they had relied upon was wrong. Yet they had not simply left. The family had been restrained, the telephone had been cut, and the 4 victims had ultimately been killed. Perry Smith had carried out most of the actual killings, according to the later confessions, while Hickok had participated in the plan and remained present. The investigators now had a far clearer picture of the connection between the robbery and the murders. The case that had seemed almost impossible to explain was beginning to make sense, though the logic behind it remained deeply disturbing. The Clutter family had not been selected because of who they were as individuals. They had been selected because Hickok believed they possessed money. That belief had originated in information provided by Floyd Wells. But the information had been inaccurate. The entire chain of events had therefore begun with a false premise. Yet the consequences were real and irreversible. For members of the Clutter family were dead. Hickok and Smith were in custody. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to identification, from identification to arrest, and from arrest toward confession. What remained was the legal question: what would happen to the 2 men who had been connected to the murders? The authorities would charge them with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Their case would move from the investigators' offices to a courtroom in Kansas, where the facts of the night would be examined, and the responsibility of each man would be challenged and argued. Hickok and Smith would attempt to raise issues concerning their mental condition, while the prosecution would present the case against them. The investigation had found its suspects, but the final judgment would belong to the courts. For the Clutter family, however, no courtroom could reverse what had happened. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon would not return home. The arrest could provide an explanation, but it could not restore the ordinary life that had existed before November 15th. The investigation had solved the mystery of who was responsible, but it had also revealed something perhaps even more disturbing. The family had been killed because 2 men believed a fortune existed inside their home, and that fortune had never existed at all. The next stage of the story would therefore move away from the search for the killers and toward the courtroom. In March 1960, Hickok and Smith would stand trial together in Finney County, Kansas. There, the state would seek to establish their guilt for 4 first-degree murders, while the defense would raise questions concerning their mental condition and their ability to be held responsible. The case that had begun with a quiet Kansas farm and an inaccurate story about money was now about to become a matter of law, judgment, and punishment. The arrest of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had brought an end to the uncertainty surrounding the identity of the men responsible for the deaths of Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. But an arrest was only the beginning of the legal process. The investigation had established a connection between the 2 men and the murders, and their confessions provided investigators with an account of what had happened. Now the case would move into a courtroom, where the state would have to establish their criminal responsibility and where the defense would have an opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. The 4 deaths that had shocked Holcomb were about to become the subject of a formal judicial proceeding. Hickok and Smith were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The charges reflected the scale of the crime, for members of one family had been killed inside their own home. The prosecution's case centered on the fact that the 2 men had planned the robbery, traveled to the Clutter property together, entered the home, restrained the occupants, and remained involved in the events that ended with the deaths of all 4 family members. The motive was also relatively clear by this point. Hickok had believed that Herbert Clutter possessed approximately $10,000 in cash. That belief had originated in information provided by Floyd Wells, who had once worked for Clutter and later shared a prison cell with Hickok. The critical problem for the defense was that the information had been false. There had been no $10,000 fortune waiting inside the house. Nevertheless, the men had acted on the belief that it existed, and 4 people had died as a consequence. The trial took place in March 1960 in Finney County, Kansas. The courtroom became the setting in which the state's case against Hickok and Smith would be presented. The prosecution did not need to establish that the 2 men had personally known the Clutters. They were essentially strangers to the family. Instead, the central issue was their involvement in the crime itself. The investigation had traced Hickok to the information about the supposed money, linked him to Perry Smith, and followed the two men until their arrest in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959. Their subsequent statements provided additional evidence concerning their participation. The defense faced the difficult task of explaining their conduct and challenging the legal consequences that followed from it. One of the most important issues raised during the proceedings concerned the mental condition of the defendants. Hickok and Smith sought to present arguments related to their psychological condition and their capacity to be held criminally responsible. This did not mean that the basic facts of the killings disappeared, for people had been murdered, and the defendants were accused of participating in those deaths. Instead, the question was whether their mental condition affected their legal responsibility and whether they were competent to face punishment under the law. Mental health issues would remain important throughout the later appeals as well. The court proceedings therefore involved more than a simple reconstruction of the night at the Clutter home. They also raised questions about the defendants themselves, whether they understood their actions, whether they could be held accountable for them, and whether the legal process had treated them fairly. These questions would become part of the larger record that followed the trial. Yet despite the issues raised by the defense, the jury reached its decision quickly. According to the case information, the jury deliberated for approximately 45 minutes before returning guilty verdicts. Hickok and Smith were found guilty of the 4 first-degree murder charges. The speed of the verdict reflected the strength of the case presented against them. The prosecution had connected the defendants to the robbery plan, the journey to the Clutter home, the murders, and their subsequent flight from Kansas. Their own statements further connected them to the crime. The jury therefore concluded that both men were criminally responsible for the deaths of Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. The verdict brought a formal conclusion to the question of guilt, but it did not immediately end the case. The sentence imposed on both men was death. Hickok and Smith were condemned to die for their participation in the 4 murders. Yet the execution would not take place immediately. The legal system allowed the defendants to challenge the verdict and sentence through a series of appeals. Those appeals would keep the case alive for approximately 5 more years. For Hickok and Smith, this meant entering a period in which the final punishment had been determined, but its date remained uncertain. For the legal system, it meant examining the issues raised by their attorneys and determining whether any error had occurred that would justify overturning the convictions or sentences. The appeals involved several arguments. Questions were raised concerning the defendant's mental condition and whether they were competent to face trial and punishment. The defense also challenged aspects of the proceedings, including questions about the fairness of the trial, the influence of publicity and media coverage, and the quality of the legal representation provided to the defendants. These arguments were not limited to a single hearing. The case continued through the appellate process, eventually reaching the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court. Each stage represented another opportunity for the defendants to challenge the outcome that had been imposed upon them. But none of those efforts ultimately succeeded in preventing the death sentences from being carried out. While the appeals continued, the Clutter family remained at the center of the case as the reason the legal process existed in the first place. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon could not participate in the proceedings. Their voices were absent from the courtroom, replaced by evidence, testimony, investigative reports, and the statements of the men responsible for their deaths. The legal process could determine guilt and punishment, but it could not restore the family that had been lost. The contrast was stark. In November 1959, the Clutters had been living in their home as a family of 4. By March 1960, their names were being spoken in a courtroom as the victims of 4 first-degree murders. Their killers had been identified, arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. But the story was not finished. The sentence created another period of waiting. Hickok and Smith would spend years in prison while their lawyers pursued appeals. The men had already gone from planning what they believed would be a quick robbery to facing the ultimate punishment. The supposed $10,000 fortune had never existed. The property they had taken amounted to only a small sum of money and a few objects. Yet the legal consequences were permanent. The state of Kansas had determined that the killings justified the death penalty. During the years that followed, the case would continue to attract attention beyond the courtroom. The unusual nature of the murders, the absence of a personal relationship between victims and killers, the false belief about the Clutter family's wealth, and the psychological questions surrounding Hickok and Smith all contributed to the continuing public fascination with the case. Eventually, Truman Capote would study the murders and the people involved, producing the book In Cold Blood, published in 1966. But at the time of the trial, that literary transformation of the case had not yet occurred. The legal record was being created, and the future of the two convicted men was being determined through appeals. The conviction itself, however, was clear. Hickok and Smith had been found guilty of killing all 4 members of the Clutter family. The jury had rejected the defense and returned guilty verdicts after a short deliberation. The court imposed death sentences on both men. The question that remained was not whether they had been convicted, but whether the punishment would actually be carried out. Their attorneys would continue to argue that legal and psychological issues justified further review. The appeals would move through the courts, extending the case well beyond the original trial. For nearly 5 years, the condemned men would remain alive while the judicial system considered their challenges. That period would become the final long chapter between the murders and the executions. The case had already passed through several stages: a false story about money, a planned robbery, 4 murders, a mysterious investigation, the breakthrough provided by Floyd Wells, the identification of Hickok and Smith, their arrest in Las Vegas, their confessions, and finally their conviction. Now came the waiting. The death sentences had been pronounced, but the final night had not yet arrived. As the appeals continued, the question became whether any court would intervene before Kansas carried out the punishment. The answer ultimately would be no. The courts would not prevent the executions. Hickok and Smith would remain condemned prisoners until April 1965, when the state would finally carry out the sentences imposed 5 years earlier. Their last years were therefore defined not by freedom or uncertainty about guilt, but by the knowledge that the legal system had already determined their fate. The Clutter case had entered its final judicial stage. The murders had been solved, the defendants convicted, and the punishment established. What remained was the long passage of time between judgment and execution. In the next chapter, that waiting period will lead to its conclusion. As the appeals reach their final stages and Richard Hickok and Perry Smith approach April 14, 1965, the date when the state of Kansas would finally carry out the death sentences imposed for the murders of Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. After the convictions in March 1960, the Clutter case entered a very different phase. The investigation was over. The trial was over. The jury had returned guilty verdicts against Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith for the murders of Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. The punishment had also been decided: death. Yet the death sentence did not mean an immediate execution. Instead, the case entered a long period of appeals, legal arguments, and uncertainty over whether the convictions and sentences would ultimately stand. For the two condemned men, the years that followed would be spent waiting inside prison while their attorneys challenged the outcome. For the Clutter family, however, there was no appeal capable of changing what had already happened. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon remained dead. Their absence could not be reversed by another hearing, another argument, or another ruling. The legal system could reconsider the circumstances surrounding the convictions, but it could not return the family to the home from which they had been taken. Hickok and Smith had been convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Their attorneys continued to raise questions about the fairness of the proceedings and about whether The defendants were legally and mentally capable of being held responsible for their actions. Mental condition became an especially important part of the arguments surrounding the case. The issue was not simply whether the murders had occurred. That fact was firmly established. The courts were being asked to consider whether there were circumstances concerning the defendants' mental states that should affect their convictions, their sentences, or the ability of the state to execute them. These questions would continue to appear as the case moved through the appellate system. Other arguments concerned the fairness of the trial itself. The defense raised questions involving publicity and the influence of media attention surrounding a crime that had already become notorious. They also challenged aspects of the legal representation provided to Hickok and Smith. Such arguments were significant because a death sentence could not simply be treated as an ordinary judgment. Once the state had decided that two men should be executed, every substantial legal question surrounding the conviction acquired enormous importance. If the trial had been fundamentally unfair, or if the defendants had not been capable of understanding the proceedings against them, the consequences could have been profound. The appeals therefore created another chapter in the story, one in which the crime itself was no longer the only focus. The courts now had to examine the legal process that had produced the death sentences. The case eventually reached the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court. Each level of review represented another opportunity for Hickok and Smith to challenge the judgment. But none of the appeals ultimately prevented the sentences from being carried out. The courts did not erase the convictions, and the death sentences remained in place. For the condemned men, this meant that the central fact of their future was already known. Unless an appeal succeeded, they would die. The uncertainty concerned when and whether the state would finally carry out the sentence. The passage of time changed the nature of the punishment. In March 1960, the death sentence had been a courtroom judgment. As the years passed, it became a future event that both men knew was approaching. They remained prisoners while lawyers continued to work through the legal system. The case refused to disappear because every appeal reopened questions that had begun with the original trial. The murder investigation itself had been relatively short compared with the years of litigation that followed. The Clutters had been killed on November 15, 1959. Hickok and Smith were arrested in Las Vegas on December 30th, only about 6 weeks later. They were tried in March 1960. By then, the authorities had moved rapidly from mystery to identification, from identification to arrest, and from arrest to conviction. But the final stage of punishment would take much longer. The 5-year period between conviction and execution became a prolonged ending to a crime that had initially unfolded within a single night. During those years, the names of the victims remained attached to the legal record. Herbert Clutter, Bonnie Clutter, Nancy Clutter, and Kenyon Clutter were not merely 4 names in a criminal case. They were the reason the case existed. Every appeal, every legal argument, and every judicial review ultimately concerned the consequences of what had happened to them. Yet the passage of time could create the illusion that the case was becoming more distant. For the Clutter family, there was no distance. Their lives had ended permanently in November 1959. The continuing legal process could determine what happened to their killers, but it could not change the fundamental loss. One of the most important questions surrounding the appeals involved the mental condition of Hickok and Smith. From the beginning of the legal proceedings, the defense had attempted to raise issues concerning their psychological state. Those arguments became part of the larger debate over criminal responsibility. A person can commit an act and still raise questions about whether the law considers that person capable of understanding or controlling the conduct in the way required for criminal punishment. In the Clutter case, those questions did not lead to the overturning of the convictions. The courts ultimately allowed the sentences to remain in force. The legal system therefore reached a consistent conclusion. Hickok and Smith remained responsible for the murders and remained subject to the death penalty. Their attempts to avoid execution through the appellate process had not succeeded. Yet the years of litigation also demonstrated the difference between a criminal investigation and a judicial process. Investigators had searched for answers to the question of who killed the Clutters. The courts were dealing with a different question: whether the state had lawfully established guilt and imposed punishment. The investigation depended upon information, evidence, confessions, and connections between people. The appeals depended upon legal principles, procedural fairness, constitutional questions, and the rights of the defendants. The two processes were connected, but they were not the same. By the middle of the 1960s, the legal avenues available to Hickok and Smith were narrowing. The death sentences imposed in 1960 remained intact. The men had spent approximately 5 years under sentence of death, waiting while their attorneys continued to challenge the judgment. Eventually, the state of Kansas would set April 14, 1965, as the date on which the executions would take place at Kansas State Penitentiary. The long period of waiting was coming to an end. There was something deeply final about that date. The murders had occurred in November 1959. The arrests had followed in December. The trial had taken place in March 1960. Then came 5 years of appeals. Now, in April 1965, the legal process had reached its conclusion. Hickok and Smith would not leave prison alive. Their convictions would remain, and the death sentences would be carried out. The case had therefore traveled an extraordinary distance from the original crime. What began as a robbery based on a false belief about $10,000 had become an investigation, a national criminal case, a trial, a death sentence, and years of appellate litigation. Through every stage, one fact remained unchanged. For members of the Clutter family had been killed. The supposed fortune that had inspired the crime had never existed. The killers had taken only a comparatively small amount of property. Yet the consequences had extended across years and generations. The approaching executions also marked the end of one aspect of the case, but not the end of its public life. The murders would continue to attract attention through books, journalism, legal records, and historical research. Truman Capote was studying the case, speaking with people connected to it, and developing the material that would eventually become In Cold Blood. When that book was published in 1966, 1 year after the executions, the Clutter murders would gain an even larger place in American cultural memory. But before the book appeared, the state of Kansas still had one final act to perform. On April 14, 1965, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith would be executed by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary. The end would come separately for each man, but on the same night. Hickok would be executed first. Smith would follow. Their deaths would bring the formal punishment for the 4 murders to an end. For the community that had been traumatized by the Clutter killings, the executions could provide a sense that the legal process had finally reached its conclusion. But justice could not recreate the family. No sentence, however severe, could restore Herbert's life, Bonnie's life, Nancy's future, or Kenyon's future. That is perhaps the most important distinction between punishment and healing. The state could impose a penalty upon the people responsible. It could not repair the lives destroyed by the crime. As April 14th approached, the story of Hickok and Smith was therefore reaching its final legal chapter. Their names had become permanently linked to the 4 victims whose lives they had taken. Their appeals had failed to prevent execution. The death sentences had survived years of legal challenges. The date had arrived. In the early hours of April 14, 1965, Richard Hickok would be executed at Kansas State Penitentiary. Later that same night, Perry Smith would meet the same fate. Their executions would close the legal chapter that had begun with the Clutter murders more than 5 years earlier. But the case itself would not disappear. In fact, another transformation was already underway. The story of the Clutter family, the investigation, the killers, and the trial was becoming the subject of one of the most influential works of true crime ever published. And in the next chapter, the focus will move from the courtroom and the prison toward the wider legacy of the murders, and toward the complicated relationship between documented fact, criminal psychology, and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The long legal process that followed the Clutter murders finally reached its end in April 1965. Nearly 5.5 years had passed since Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter were killed inside their Kansas home. Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith had been arrested, convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to death, and then kept alive for years while their attorneys pursued appeals. Arguments concerning mental condition, the fairness of the proceedings, publicity, and the quality of legal representation had all been examined. The case had reached the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court, but none of those efforts ultimately prevented the executions. The death sentences remained in force. On April 14, 1965, the state of Kansas carried out those sentences at Kansas State Penitentiary. The final hours of the case were therefore not a mystery. There would be no last-minute reversal that changed the outcome. The state had determined that Hickok and Smith were responsible for the deaths of the 4 Clutter family members, and the punishment imposed by the court would now be carried out. Richard Hickok was executed first. According to the Kansas records, he was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. Perry Smith followed, and his death was confirmed at 1:19 a.m. Both men were hanged on the same date, April 14, 1965. With their executions, the formal legal process surrounding the murders came to an end. The state had completed the punishment imposed by the court. But the end of the executions did not mean the end of the Clutter story. In some ways, the case was only beginning its transformation into a permanent part of American cultural history. The murders had already shocked Holcomb and the wider region because of the nature of the crime. For people from the same family had been killed in their own home, despite having no apparent personal relationship with their attackers. The killers had come looking for money based on information that proved to be false. The supposed $10,000 fortune did not exist. After the murders, Hickok and Smith took only a small amount of property, including a few dozen dollars, a radio, and binoculars. The enormous destruction caused by the crime stood in stark contrast to the tiny material reward. For lives had been lost, and the original objective of the robbery had never existed in the first place. That contradiction helped make the case difficult to forget. It was not simply a story about 2 criminals and 4 victims. It was a story about how a false belief could become the beginning of an irreversible chain of events. Richard Hickok had heard from Floyd Wells that Herbert Clutter supposedly kept a safe containing approximately $10,000. Hickok later contacted Perry Smith, and together they decided to rob the Clutter home. They entered the property expecting money. Instead, they encountered a family. When the money was not found, the situation escalated into captivity and murder. The telephone was cut. The family members were restrained. Herbert and Kenyon were held in the basement area, while Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. Then the 4 were killed. According to the later confessions, Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings, while Hickok participated in the plan and remained present. The legal system ultimately held both men responsible for all 4 murders. Their executions therefore closed the question of criminal punishment, but they did not answer every question raised by the case. One of those unanswered questions concerned the psychological dimensions of the crime. Perry Smith in particular became an object of intense interest because of his background and psychological condition. Questions about his mental state had already appeared during the legal proceedings, and later discussions of the case continued to examine his personality and history. Yet it is important to distinguish between psychological interpretation and legal fact. Whatever debates existed about Smith's mental condition, the courts determined that he was criminally responsible for the 4 murders and sentenced him to death. The same principle applies to Hickok. His role as the person who helped initiate the robbery did not disappear simply because Smith was identified as the person who carried out most of the actual killings. Hickok had received the information about the supposed money, contacted Smith, participated in the robbery plan, traveled to the Clutter home, and remained involved in the crime. The court convicted both men of the 4 murders. Their individual roles could be debated, but the legal judgment was clear. Another reason the case remained prominent was the work of Truman Capote. Capote became deeply interested in the murders and spent years researching the people and events connected to them. His work culminated in Cold Blood, published in 1966, 1 year after the executions. The book transformed the Clutter murders into a story known far beyond Kansas. It became one of the most famous works associated with true crime and literary nonfiction. Capote's approach was different from a conventional newspaper account or a simple police report. He attempted to reconstruct the lives of the victims, the movements of the killers, the investigation, and the psychological dimensions of the crime. Through that approach, the Clutter case entered the broader American cultural imagination. But the popularity of In Cold Blood also created an important distinction between documented history and literary reconstruction. The book was based on extensive research, interviews, and information surrounding the case. But it was not simply a reproduction of the official investigative record. Some details concerning dialogue, private thoughts, and the internal experiences of the people involved were reconstructed by Capote. Because of that, researchers and historians have continued to distinguish between what is firmly documented in official records and what belongs to Capote's narrative interpretation. This distinction matters especially in a true crime story. The temptation to make a case more dramatic can sometimes blur the boundary between evidence and storytelling. The Clutter murders do not require invented details to be horrifying. The documented facts are already devastating. 4 members of a family were killed. The motive was connected to a false belief about money. The killers were strangers to the victims. The family was restrained inside their own home. The perpetrators fled, were identified through an investigation that eventually involved Floyd Wells, were arrested in Las Vegas, confessed, stood trial, were convicted, and were ultimately executed. Those facts alone form a story of extraordinary tragedy. The official records also preserve a substantial historical record of the case. Kansas Historical Society materials include investigative documents, confessions, reports, trial materials, prison records, appeals, and documentation concerning the executions. The collection covers the case from the initial investigation in 1959 through the arrests, trial, convictions, appeals, and executions in 1965. That surviving documentation allows the case to be studied not merely as a famous story, but as an actual criminal proceeding. It provides a way to separate the historical record from later interpretations. The Clutter murders also raise a difficult question about the relationship between victims and public memory. The names of Hickok and Smith became widely recognized, but the 4 people whose deaths created the case deserve equal attention. Herbert Clutter was a 48-year-old farmer. Bonnie was 45. Nancy was 16. Kenyon was 15. Their lives should not be reduced to the night they died. Yet the nature of true crime often creates an imbalance in which the perpetrators receive disproportionate attention because their actions generate the mystery and the narrative. The Clutter case demonstrates why that imbalance matters. The killer's personalities, backgrounds, confessions, and legal arguments may be historically interesting, but none of those subjects should obscure the fact that the central tragedy was the destruction of 4 innocent lives. The final lesson of the case is therefore not simply that 2 murderers were caught and punished. It is that an entire family was lost because 2 men acted upon information that was wrong. The money they expected did not exist. The people they killed had no meaningful connection to them. The reward was insignificant, yet the consequences were permanent. The Clutter murders remain disturbing because there is no satisfying proportion between cause and consequence. A rumor about money became a robbery. The robbery became captivity. The captivity became 4 murders. The murders became an investigation. The investigation led to arrest. The arrest led to trial. The trial led to death sentences. and 5 years later, the sentences ended with 2 executions. But even after Hickok and Smith were dead, the story continued through books, historical records, and public memory. In cold blood ensured that the case would remain known to generations who had never heard of Holcomb. In 1959, yet beneath the literary legacy, beneath the courtroom history, and beneath the fascination with the killers, the most important fact remains simple. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter were a family. They were living their lives when 2 strangers arrived because of a false belief about money. Their lives ended that night, but the consequences of their deaths continued for decades. The case would become famous. The killers would become notorious. The book would become a landmark of true crime literature. But none of those later developments could change what happened inside the Clutter home. On April 14, 1965, Hickok and Smith died at Kansas State Penitentiary. Their legal story was finished. The Clutter family's story, however, remained. It survived in the memories of those who knew them, in official records, and in the historical record of one of America's most notorious family murders. The story of the Clutter family murders does not truly end with the execution of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. On April 14, 1965, the legal system of Kansas carried out the sentences imposed upon the 2 men, ending a process that had begun with 4 murders in a rural Kansas home more than 5 years earlier. Hickok was executed first, and his death was confirmed at 12:41 a.m. Smith followed, and his death was confirmed at 1:19 a.m. Both men died by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary. Their executions brought the formal legal history of the case to a close. But punishment and closure are not the same thing. The state could execute the people responsible for the murders. It could not undo the murders themselves. It could not restore Herbert Clutter to his farm, return Bonnie to her family, or give Nancy and Kenyon the years of life that had been taken from them. The finality of the executions therefore belongs to the legal system. For the victims, there was no equivalent final chapter. Their absence remained permanent. The Clutter family murders continue to be remembered because of the extraordinary contrast between the ordinary lives of the victims and the violence that ended them. Herbert William Herb Clutter was 48 years old and had built a reputation as a successful and respected farmer. Bonnie Clutter was 45. Their daughter Nancy was 16, and their son Kenyon was 15. Their 2 older daughters had already moved away, leaving these 4 members of the immediate family in the home. There was nothing in the information surrounding the case to suggest that they were living in anticipation of violence. They were not the enemies of Hickok or Smith. They had no meaningful personal relationship with the 2 men. Their selection as victims came from an entirely different source, a false belief about money. Richard Hickok had heard from Floyd Wells, a former employee of Herbert Clutter, and a man who had later been incarcerated with him, that Clutter supposedly possessed a safe containing approximately $10,000 in cash. Hickok accepted that information as the basis for a robbery plan. After leaving prison, he contacted Perry Smith. Together, they decided to enter the Clutter home and take the supposed money. The plan depended on something that was never there. Herbert Clutter did not maintain the $10,000 cash fortune Hickok imagined. He primarily used checks and ordinary payment methods. There was no hidden treasure waiting inside the house. Yet the men acted upon the belief anyway. On November 15, 1959, they went to the Clutter property armed and entered the home. What followed transformed a planned robbery into a massacre. The family was restrained. The telephone was cut. Herbert and Kenyon were held in the basement area, while Bonnie and Nancy were kept in bedrooms. Eventually, all 4 were killed with a shotgun. According to the later confessions, Perry Smith carried out most of the actual killings. Richard Hickok, however, had participated in the robbery plan and was present during the crime. The distinction between their individual actions became part of the later discussion of the case. But the legal conclusion was that both men were responsible for the 4 murders. The most disturbing feature of the crime may be what happened when the original objective failed. The killers had entered expecting a substantial amount of cash. They did not find it. They could have abandoned the robbery. Instead, the situation continued until 4 people were dead. What they eventually took was only a small amount of property, including a few dozen dollars in objects such as a radio and binoculars. The material reward was almost meaningless compared with the destruction they had caused. That disproportion remains at the heart of the case. For human lives were taken for something that did not exist. The investigation that followed was therefore forced to answer 2 questions at once. Who had killed the Clutters and why had they been selected? At first, there was no obvious answer. The family did not appear to have a personal enemy who could explain the murders. The telephone had been cut, the victims had been restrained, and the perpetrators had left Kansas. The case might have remained without a clear direction if not for Floyd Wells. When Wells learned about the murders, he remembered what he had once told Hickok. He realized that Hickok knew about the Clutter household and the supposed money. Wells contacted authorities, providing investigators with a crucial connection. The name Richard Hickok entered the investigation, and through Hickok the authorities were eventually led to Perry Smith. Their movements after the crime were traced, and on December 30th, 1959, approximately 6 weeks after the murders, both men were arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada. The arrests changed the nature of the case. Investigators were no longer searching for unknown killers. They now had 2 suspects in custody. Hickok and Smith initially denied their involvement, but during questioning, Hickok eventually began to confess. He attempted to place much of the direct responsibility for the killings on Smith, identifying Smith as the person who carried out the actual murders. Smith later gave his own confession. The statements became part of the official record and helped investigators reconstruct the crime. The case then moved into the courts. In March 1960, Hickok and Smith were tried together in Finney County, Kansas. Both faced 4 first-degree murder charges. The defense raised issues concerning their mental condition and their legal responsibility, while other arguments later addressed the fairness of the proceedings, publicity surrounding the case, and the quality of their legal representation. The jury deliberated for approximately 45 minutes before returning guilty verdicts. Both men were sentenced to death. Yet the legal system did not immediately carry out those sentences. For approximately 5 years, the case continued through appeals. The defense challenged various aspects of the convictions and sentences, including questions involving mental condition and the fairness of the trial. The appeals eventually reached the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court. None of those efforts succeeded in preventing the executions. The death sentences remained in place. During those years, the case gradually acquired a life beyond the courtroom. The murders had already become notorious, but the attention surrounding them expanded significantly through Truman Capote's investigation. Capote spent years researching the case and interviewing people connected to it. His work became In Cold Blood, published in 1966, 1 year after the executions. The book became a landmark associated with true crime and literary nonfiction. It introduced the Clutter murders to a much larger audience and helped establish the case as one of the most widely remembered crimes in 20th century America. But the literary legacy also makes it important to distinguish between documented evidence and narrative reconstruction. In Cold Blood was based on extensive research, but it was not simply a reproduction of the official Kansas case file. Some dialogue, thoughts, and psychological details were reconstructed as part of Capote's narrative method. For that reason, the historical record should remain the foundation when discussing what actually happened. Kansas Historical Society materials preserve documents connected with the case, including investigative records, confessions, reports, trial materials, appeals, prison records, and documentation concerning the executions. These records allow the murders to be examined as a historical and legal event rather than merely as a famous story. They also reinforce a critical principle in true crime storytelling. The documented facts are powerful enough without invention. There is no need to create conversations that were never recorded or thoughts that cannot be verified. The established facts already contain the essential tragedy. For people were killed in their own home. The killers had come because of a false belief about money. The supposed fortune did not exist. The victims had no meaningful personal relationship with their attackers. The perpetrators fled, were identified through the investigation, were arrested in Las Vegas, confessed, were tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and eventually executed. The Clutter murders also demonstrate how easily public memory can become focused on perpetrators rather than victims. Hickok and Smith became famous because of their crimes. Their personalities, backgrounds, statements, and legal arguments attracted attention. Capote's book further increased that fascination. But the central human story belongs to Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon. Their lives should not be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Herbert was a farmer and a respected member of his community. Bonnie was his wife. Nancy and Kenyon were teenagers. Their futures were still unfolding when the murders ended them. The most important conclusion, then, is not that two notorious criminals eventually received the punishment imposed upon them. It is that 4 ordinary lives were destroyed by a crime rooted in a false assumption. The supposed $10,000 fortune never existed. The killers gained only a small amount of money and property, yet the consequences were permanent. The case began with a rumor, became a robbery, turned into 4 murders, led to an investigation, produced arrests and confessions, passed through a trial and years of appeals, and ended with 2 executions. But even after the legal process was finished, the story remained alive in historical records and public memory. That endurance can be understood as both a warning and a responsibility. True crime should not transform suffering into entertainment at the expense of the people who suffered. The Clutter case deserves to be remembered not because the killers were fascinating, but because the victims were real. On the night of November 15th, 1959, Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon were living inside their family home. By the end of that night, all 4 were dead. Nothing that happened afterward could change that fact. The arrests brought answers. The trial brought judgment. The appeals tested the legal process. The executions brought punishment. Truman Capote's book brought lasting fame to the case. But none of those things restored what had been lost. The final lesson of the Clutter family murders therefore lies in that irreparable difference between justice and restoration. Justice could determine responsibility. It could impose a sentence. It could close a criminal case. But it could not give a family back its future. The names of Hickok and Smith may remain attached to the crime, but the names that should remain at its center are Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. Their lives existed before the murders, and their value did not depend upon the tragedy that later made them famous. The case remains one of the most haunting crimes in American history precisely because its cause was so senseless, its consequences so irreversible, and its victims so removed from the criminal world that ultimately destroyed them. In the end, the Clutter story is not simply about how 4 people died. It is about how 4 lives were lived, how abruptly those lives were taken, and how the consequences of one false belief continued long after the men who acted upon it were gone.